My mom excluded me from the inheritance. A year later, I gave her a taste of her own medicine. I was 28 years old when my mother called to tell me that my grandmother had passed away. I remember where I was, sitting at my desk in a small marketing firm in Atlanta, where I worked as a junior account executive. I remember the way the afternoon light was coming through the office windows, casting everything in a shade of gold that suddenly felt obscene given the news I was receiving. My grandmother had been sick for a long time, so the death itself wasn't a shock. What came after, though, that was the shock that would redefine everything about my relationship with my mother and everything about my understanding of family. My name is Rachel, and this is the story of what it means to be invisible to the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. My mother, Patricia, had never been what you'd call warm. I don't mean that in a way that's trying to be poetic or literary. I mean it literally. She was a cold woman. She showed affection rarely, praised almost never, and had a way of making you feel like your presence was something she tolerated rather than something she cherished. My childhood was marked by a kind of emotional neglect that didn't look dramatic from the outside. My mother provided food, shelter, and the basic necessities. But there was no warmth beneath those provisions. There were no hugs goodnight. There were no words of encouragement when I brought home good grades. There were no maternal moments where she would brush my hair or tuck me into bed or tell me that she was proud of me. Instead, there was silence. There was absence. There was the feeling of being raised by someone who was going through the motions of motherhood without ever actually feeling the weight of that responsibility. My older sister, Eleanor, was different. Eleanor was the golden child. Eleanor got my mother's attention, my mother's praise, my mother's affection, such as it was. Eleanor was prettier, smarter, more accomplished. Eleanor was the one my mother bragged about at church. Eleanor was the one my mother actually seemed to like. I was the other daughter. The one who tried too hard. The one who wasn't quite good enough. The one who learned early on not to expect anything from her mother except disappointment. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was the opposite. Grandma Catherine was warm, generous, present. She was the person who showed up for my recitals, who helped me with my homework, who made me feel like I mattered. When my mother was cold, my grandmother was sun. She was the light in a childhood that was otherwise characterized by emotional shadows. Grandma Catherine had always been wealthy. Not obscenely so, but comfortably wealthy. Her husband had been a successful businessman, and she'd inherited money from her own parents. By the time I was growing up, she had a significant estate, a house worth several $1 million in one of the nicest neighborhoods in Charlotte, North Carolina, plus investment portfolios and various properties. I never thought much about that inheritance. I loved my grandmother, but not because of her money. I loved her because she loved me. The inheritance was something distant, theoretical, not something that seemed relevant to my actual life. That changed on the day she died. The funeral was held in Charlotte and the whole family gathered. My mother, my sister Eleanor, Eleanor's husband, various aunts and uncles. We all sat in the front row of the church and listened to eulogies that painted my grandmother as a saint, which she largely was, though she'd been a saint specifically to me because my mother wasn't capable of being one. After the service, my mother's lawyer requested a meeting with the immediate family. We gathered in his office, a formal wood-paneled space that smelled like old money and older decisions. The lawyer explained my grandmother's will. The estate was valued at approximately $4.2 million. My grandmother had made specific bequests. Money to various charities, some items of sentimental value to specific relatives, and then the bulk of the estate to be divided among her children and grandchildren. My mother would receive approximately $1.5 million. My sister Eleanor would receive approximately $1 million. I would receive nothing. The lawyer read this aloud like it was the most normal thing in the world. He didn't seem to notice the way I stopped breathing. He didn't seem to notice the way my mother's face showed no reaction whatsoever. He simply continued, explaining the details of trusts and tax implications and the timeline for distribution. I don't remember leaving the lawyer's office. I remember being there, and then I remember being outside on the street in Charlotte, the afternoon heat pressing down on me like a physical weight, and I couldn't quite figure out how I'd gotten there. My mother caught up with me as I was walking toward my car. She touched my arm and I turned to face her. I was waiting for an explanation. I was waiting for her to tell me that there'd been a mistake, that the lawyer had misread the will, that my grandmother had intended something different. Instead, my mother said this: "Your grandmother was very clear about her wishes. She wanted Eleanor to be taken care of because she knew Eleanor would marry well but might struggle financially. And she left me the bulk because I'm her daughter. You weren't included in her plans, and I'm sure you can understand why." I asked her why. Why would my grandmother exclude me? The woman who had been at every important moment of my life, who had loved me in ways my mother never had, why would she leave me nothing? My mother explained it in a tone that suggested she was stating obvious facts. My grandmother had always felt that I was less capable than Eleanor. My grandmother had worried that if she left me money, I wouldn't be responsible enough to manage it properly. My grandmother had thought it was better for the money to go to people who would use it wisely. Besides, my mother added, you have your job. You're making decent money. You don't need an inheritance. I stood there in the Charlotte heat, listening to my mother explain why my grandmother had erased me from her will, and I felt something break inside me. Not dramatically. Not with any outward sign. But internally something fundamental shifted. Some last remaining belief that my mother was anything other than cruel and calculating simply evaporated. That night in my hotel room I called Eleanor. I asked her if she'd known about the will before the reading. I asked her if she'd been part of keeping this from me. She admitted that our mother had called her the day before the funeral and told her what was in the will. Eleanor had known I was being excluded. She'd kept it secret. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. Because I didn't know how to, Eleanor said. And then with a tone that suggested she thought she was being helpful. Maybe this is actually for the best. Maybe it's a sign that you need to build your own life rather than relying on family money. I hung up on her. The drive back to Atlanta the next day was one of the longest drives of my life. I had 8 hours alone with my thoughts, and my thoughts were not kind places to be. I was angry, not just at my mother and sister but at my grandmother. How could she have made that decision? How could she have looked me in the eye my entire childhood, made me feel loved and valued, and then written me out of her will like I was nothing? It wasn't until several months later that I learned the truth. My mother had visited my grandmother in her final weeks, when she was in hospice and heavily medicated. My mother had suggested to the lawyer that my grandmother wanted to change her will. My mother had influenced the decision. My grandmother had never intended to exclude me. My mother had simply used her position of power over a dying woman to ensure that I received nothing. That realization was worse than the exclusion itself. That realization made me understand that my mother wasn't just cold. She was actively malicious. She wasn't just withholding love. She was actively trying to hurt me. And she'd succeeded. In the year following the reading of the will, I spiraled. Not in a way that was visible to anyone around me. Externally, I continued to go to work to pay my bills, to maintain the facade of a functional adult. But internally I was falling apart. I obsessed over the unfairness of it. I calculated what my share would have been. Approximately $700,000. I imagined the life I could have had with that money. I imagined the security, the ability to take risks, the freedom. Instead I had nothing. I had a job that paid $50,000 a year. I had an apartment I could barely afford. I had the knowledge that the two people who were supposed to love me most in the world had conspired to exclude me from something that should have been mine. I didn't speak to my mother for months. When she called, I didn't answer. When she sent emails, I didn't respond. I was angry in a way that I'd never been angry before, and I didn't trust myself to communicate with her without saying something I couldn't take back. But anger, I eventually realized, was a cage. And I was spending all my energy maintaining that cage when I could have been building something else. It took nearly 6 months for me to understand what I actually needed. I needed to stop waiting for my mother to validate me, to love me, to acknowledge that she'd done something wrong. Because she would never do those things. She would never apologize. She would never feel guilty. She would simply continue being the cold, calculating person she'd always been, and expecting anything different was setting myself up for endless disappointment. I had to accept that my mother didn't love me. Not in the way mothers are supposed to love their daughters. Not in the way my grandmother had loved me. My mother was incapable of that kind of love, and no amount of wishing could change that. But what I could do was decide who I was going to become in the absence of that love. What I could do was build a life that didn't depend on her approval, her inheritance, or her capacity for affection. What I could do was prove that I didn't need her money because I was capable of making my own. That decision, made in anger but sustained through determination, became the foundation for everything that followed. The anger that fueled my decision to rebuild my life without my mother's money or approval lasted approximately 3 weeks. After that, it transformed into something else. A quieter, more sustainable form of determination. The kind of determination that doesn't need constant emotional intensity to maintain itself. The kind that becomes a baseline way of living. I made a decision in that first month after the will reading. I was going to build a life so independent, so financially secure, and so genuinely fulfilling that I would never again feel vulnerable to my mother's indifference. I was going to prove, primarily to myself but secondarily to her, that I didn't need her money because I was capable of making my own. The job at the marketing firm wasn't going to get me there. $50,000 a year was stable, but it was also a ceiling. It was the kind of salary that would keep me comfortable but never prosperous. It was the kind of salary that meant I would always be working, always be stressed about money, always be vulnerable to unexpected expenses. I needed more. I started by taking night classes in digital marketing and business strategy. I spent my evenings in community college classrooms with other people who were trying to improve their lives. Nurses wanting to transition to healthcare administration, teachers looking to move into corporate training, people like me who were determined to build something more than what they currently had. I was working full-time during the day and studying most nights. I was sleeping about 5 hours a night, running on coffee and spite. Spite is not, I would learn, a sustainable long-term fuel source. But for those first 6 months it worked. By the end of that year I had my certification in digital marketing strategy. I had also been quietly building a portfolio of freelance clients on the side. Small businesses that needed help with their online presence, social media strategy, website design. I was charging them $500 to $1,000 per project, which meant that by the end of that first year, I'd made an additional $20,000 in freelance income. My mother tried to contact me during this time. She called occasionally, left voicemails that I didn't listen to, sent emails that I deleted without reading. I wasn't trying to punish her. I was simply trying to sever the connection that had been causing me pain. It's hard to rebuild yourself when you're still emotionally tied to the person who broke you in the first place. Eleanor reached out as well. She wanted to talk things through and rebuild the relationship. I didn't respond to her either. Not out of vindictiveness but out of self-preservation. Eleanor was my mother's daughter in every way that mattered, and I couldn't trust her to not take sides with the woman who'd raised her. By the end of year 1 the rejection was still fresh, but it was also starting to feel less personal. I was beginning to understand that my mother's coldness and my sister's complicity weren't actually about me. They were about them. About their own limitations, their own fears, their own inability to understand or value people who were different from what they expected. That realization, that their rejection said more about them than it said about me, was transformative. It allowed me to stop taking it personally. And once I stopped taking it personally, I could focus entirely on building. Year 2 was about acceleration. I left the marketing firm and started freelancing full-time. It was terrifying. I had no safety net, no health insurance through an employer, no steady paycheck. But I also had no meetings to attend, no office politics to navigate, and no boss telling me that I wasn't quite ready for promotion. I rented a small office space shared with other freelancers and entrepreneurs. I got my own LLC. I branded myself as a digital strategy consultant for small and medium-sized businesses. And I worked harder than I'd ever worked in my life. I was winning clients by doing exceptional work. I was building a reputation by delivering results that exceeded expectations. I was earning referrals because my clients trusted me and wanted to recommend me to their networks. By the end of year 2, I was making over $150,000 per year from freelance work. It still didn't feel like enough. During this time I was dating a man named Marcus. He was a software developer, intelligent and kind in a way that made me understand that not everyone was emotionally unavailable. We met at a coffee shop where I was working and he asked me what I was so intently focused on. I told him about my business plan. Instead of dismissing it or making me feel silly, he asked thoughtful questions about my strategy. He offered insights. He believed in what I was building. For the first time in my adult life, I had someone in my corner who wasn't obligated to be there because of blood. Marcus was choosing to support me. That made all the difference. By year 2.5, I was earning enough that I could start investing. I bought a condo in Atlanta. Nothing fancy but something that was mine. I invested in index funds and dividend-paying stocks. I started building wealth, not just income. My mother found out about the condo through the grapevine. Apparently, I'd been discussed at a church event that she attended. She called me to congratulate me, as if that phone call could undo the years of neglect or the cruelty of the inheritance exclusion. I was polite but distant. I didn't tell her about my business. I didn't tell her about my plans. I simply acknowledged her call and ended it as quickly as possible. What I didn't tell her was that I was building an empire. Year 3 saw me expand from being a freelance consultant to starting my own agency. I hired 2 employees, young, talented people who were hungry to build something. We started taking on bigger clients, doing bigger projects, commanding bigger fees. By the end of year 3, my agency was generating $650,000 in annual revenue, and I was personally netting about $250,000 per year. I was 29 years old, and I was wealthier than my mother had ever been. During year 3, something interesting happened. My mother called me again, and this time she didn't just make polite conversation. She asked if I would be interested in helping with her finances. She mentioned, almost casually, that she was having some difficulty managing her money. She was getting older, she said, and she was thinking about retirement. I was struck by the irony. She had excluded me from an inheritance that she thought I wasn't responsible enough to handle. But now that she was facing her own financial uncertainty, she wanted my expertise. She wanted my help. I told her that I was busy with my business, but that I could recommend a financial advisor. Then I hung up. I won't claim that I didn't feel satisfaction at that moment. I did. There was a small, petty part of me that enjoyed the irony of her needing me, of me being in the position to help but choosing not to. But the satisfaction was hollow. It didn't change anything. It didn't undo the years of coldness. It didn't return the $700,000. It didn't make the original wound any less painful. What it did do was confirm something that I'd suspected. My mother's world was shrinking. The inheritance she'd received from my grandmother, the money she'd manipulated her way into having, wasn't being managed well. She didn't understand finances. She didn't have a plan. She'd spent the last several years making increasingly poor financial decisions, and now in her 60s she was starting to panic about her future. It was almost poetic. She'd excluded me from wealth because she thought I wasn't responsible enough. And now she was facing the consequences of not being responsible enough herself. By the end of year 4, my agency was generating over $2 million in annual revenue. I had 10 employees. I was being profiled in business magazines as a rising entrepreneur to watch. I was speaking at conferences about digital strategy. I was building something that was genuinely impressive and genuinely mine. Marcus and I got married in year 4. It was a small wedding, just close friends and his family. I didn't invite my mother or Eleanor. The absence was deliberate. This was my celebration, my joy, my moment. I didn't want it diminished by the presence of people who had never really loved me. My mother sent a card with a generic message. Eleanor sent flowers. Neither gesture mattered to me. What mattered was that I had a partner who believed in me. I had employees who respected me. I had clients who trusted me. I had a life that was genuinely worth living. Not because it was successful in the eyes of others, but because it was successful in my own eyes. I was proud of what I'd built. I was proud of who I'd become. And I was no longer waiting for my mother to acknowledge that pride. I was providing it for myself. By the end of year 5, approximately 1 year after the will reading, I was 33 years old, the owner of a thriving digital marketing agency, married to a man who genuinely loved me with a net worth approaching $2 million. My mother, meanwhile, was facing financial difficulties. She'd called me several more times, becoming increasingly desperate with each call. She'd spent the inheritance poorly. She'd made bad investments. She trusted the wrong people. And now she was looking at a retirement that was far less comfortable than she'd anticipated. She didn't explicitly ask for help, but the implication was there in every conversation. She was dropping hints about her financial struggles. She was mentioning how much she'd enjoyed my success. She was suggesting that maybe we could repair our relationship. I listened to these calls with a complicated mix of emotions. On one level, I wanted to tell her exactly where to go. I wanted to remind her that she'd had access to an inheritance and had squandered it. I wanted to point out that I'd offered to help with financial advice and she'd dismissed the offer. I wanted to make her feel the way she'd made me feel. Small, inadequate, unworthy. But I also understood by that point that revenge, even justified revenge, doesn't actually make you feel better. Satisfaction is temporary. The pleasure of making someone regret their cruelty fades quickly. What remains is just the knowledge that you've responded to cruelty with more cruelty, and you haven't actually solved anything. Still, I wasn't ready to forgive her. And I certainly wasn't ready to bail her out financially. She'd made her choices. Now she could live with the consequences. It was during a conversation with Marcus that he asked me what I wanted to happen next. What did I want my mother to experience as a result of her actions? What would constitute justice in my mind? I didn't have an immediate answer. But I knew that whatever that answer was, it wasn't about punishing her. It was about something else entirely. It was about teaching her a lesson that she seemed incapable of learning. That how you treat people matters. That the negligence you inflict comes back to you. That the world doesn't actually owe you loyalty or support or love, no matter how much you might feel entitled to it. I didn't know yet how that lesson would be taught. But I knew that my mother was about to experience a very practical education in consequences. And unlike the inheritance she'd tried to hide from me, this was an inheritance she wouldn't be able to avoid. By year 6 after the inheritance exclusion, I had become someone I barely recognized. Not in a negative way, I was proud of who I'd become. But the transformation was so complete that sometimes I would catch myself in a meeting with a major client or speaking at a conference and I would feel a moment of dissonance. Who was this woman giving advice on million-dollar digital strategies? Who was this woman that major corporations wanted to hire for consultation? Who was this woman that people respected and sought out for guidance? The answer I eventually understood was me. I was that woman. I had built her through 5 years of relentless work, strategic thinking, and an almost obsessive commitment to proving that I didn't need my mother's validation or her money. My agency, which I'd named Clarity Digital, had grown into one of the most respected digital marketing firms in the Southeast. We had offices in Atlanta, Charlotte, and Nashville. We employed 43 people. We worked with clients ranging from mid-sized tech companies to Fortune 500 corporations. Our annual revenue had grown to over $6 million, and my personal net worth had climbed to approximately $5 million. I was 34 years old. Marcus and I had moved into a beautiful home in one of Atlanta's nicest neighborhoods. We were talking about starting a family. We took vacations to places we'd always wanted to visit. We could afford anything we wanted, and more importantly, we could afford to be generous with others. During this period, my mother's situation had deteriorated significantly. She called me several times, each call more desperate than the last. The inheritance from my grandmother was largely gone. The house she'd been living in, a modest home in a modest neighborhood, was at risk of foreclosure. She'd made poor investment decisions. She trusted people who'd taken advantage of her. She was facing a retirement that looked nothing like what she'd anticipated. I knew these details not because she'd asked for my help, but because Eleanor had called me in a moment of crisis. Eleanor, for all her earlier complicity in keeping the will exclusion secret, was apparently still trying to be a good daughter. She'd asked if I would be willing to help our mother financially. She'd suggested that maybe it was time to let go of the past and come together as a family. I told Eleanor that I would consider it, but I didn't commit to anything. I wasn't ready yet. The wounds were still too fresh. The betrayal was still too vivid in my memory. What I did do was start investigating my mother's situation more carefully. I hired a financial advisor, not for her but for myself, and had him look into her circumstances. What he found was disturbing but unsurprising. My mother had approximately $80,000 in remaining savings, a house that was worth about $250,000 but that she'd already borrowed against twice, and minimal income prospects. She was facing retirement without adequate savings, without a pension, without any real safety net. In 5 years she would be in serious financial trouble. The irony was exquisite. She'd excluded me from an inheritance because she didn't think I was responsible enough to manage money. And in the intervening years she'd lost nearly everything through her own irresponsibility. During this same period my mother made attempts to reconcile with me. She called and apologized for the inheritance exclusion. She said she'd been wrong. She said she wanted to rebuild our relationship. She said she was proud of what I'd accomplished. The apology felt hollow. It didn't feel like genuine remorse. It felt like desperation. She wasn't apologizing because she'd realized she was wrong. She was apologizing because she needed something from me, and she was hoping that an apology would make me willing to give it. I didn't tell her any of this directly. I was polite but distant. I acknowledged her apology without accepting it. I said that I was glad she was proud of me, and I didn't offer to help. Eleanor grew frustrated with my refusal to reconcile. She called me multiple times, pointing out that our mother was struggling, that she was getting older, that family was supposed to help family. She suggested that I was being petty, that I was holding a grudge, that I should be the bigger person and extend a hand. What Eleanor didn't understand was that this wasn't about pettiness or holding a grudge. This was about boundaries. This was about protecting myself from someone who had shown repeatedly that she was incapable of genuine love or loyalty. This was about refusing to set myself on fire to keep someone else warm, especially when that someone else had spent my entire childhood making me feel small. I told Eleanor that I would make my own decision about how to relate to our mother in my own time. Until then she needed to stop pressuring me. By year 6 my mother had lost the house. She'd moved into a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood. She was working part-time at a retail store, the same kind of job she'd held when I was a child, the kind of job that she'd clearly never moved beyond. She was living paycheck to paycheck. She was facing a future that looked a lot like the futures I'd watched her create for her clients back when I was a marketing consultant. A future of financial insecurity and missed opportunities. And I was watching it happen from a position of complete financial security. This was when something shifted inside me. Not sympathy exactly, but a kind of clarity. I understood finally what the exclusion had actually been. It was the greatest gift my mother could have given me. If I'd received that inheritance, I would have had $700,000. That money would have made my early years easier, sure. But it would have also robbed me of something essential. The knowledge that I could build something real, something substantial, something that came entirely from my own effort and ingenuity. An inheritance is a gift. But a $700,000 head start that I hadn't earned would have always felt like something that wasn't really mine. It would have always been my grandmother's money, not my money. Every success I achieved would have been tinged with the knowledge that I'd started with advantages that others didn't have. Instead, I'd started with nothing. I'd built everything through my own determination, my own intelligence, my own willingness to work harder than anyone else. And as a result, every single thing I'd accomplished felt genuinely mine. My mother, on the other hand, had started with almost $2 million. And she'd squandered it through poor decisions, lack of vision, and an inability to learn from her mistakes. She'd had every advantage and she'd lost it all. That was the real lesson. Not that she'd been cruel to exclude me, though she had been. But that excluding me had actually freed me in ways that I was only now beginning to fully appreciate. During year 6, I made a decision. I decided that I was going to establish a foundation. Not to help my mother, I still wasn't ready for that. But to help people who had experienced similar exclusions, similar negligence, similar feelings of unworthiness. I was going to take the knowledge I'd gained through my journey and the resources I'd accumulated and use them to help others who were trying to build lives independent of the people who didn't believe in them. I called it the Second Start Foundation, and its mission was to provide mentorship, education, and startup capital to young adults who wanted to build careers but lacked family support or financial backing. The foundation became my passion project. I was devoting 20% of my time to it by the end of year 6, working with young entrepreneurs, helping them develop business plans, connecting them with resources and mentors. It was fulfilling in a way that my commercial work, as successful as it was, had never quite been. It was also the moment when I finally began to heal from the wound of my mother's rejection. Because I'd transformed that rejection into something meaningful. I'd turned my pain into purpose. I'd used my success not just to prove something to myself, but to help others who were in similar situations. During this time, my mother tried one more time to reach out to me. She called and asked if she could come visit me. She said she wanted to see my home, to see my life, to understand what I'd built. I agreed, though I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe I was curious about what she would feel when she saw the evidence of my success. Maybe I thought it would be good for me to confront her in my own space, in the context of everything I'd built. Maybe I was finally ready to have the conversation that we should have had years ago. She came on a Saturday afternoon in early autumn. She was smaller than I remembered her being. Her hair was grayer. She looked tired in a way that suggested the weight of her poor decisions had finally caught up with her physically. I showed her my home. We walked through the rooms. The professional kitchen that Marcus and I actually used, the library where I did much of my work, the media room, the guest bedrooms. She looked around with an expression that was hard to read. Was she impressed? Was she envious? Was she regretful? I couldn't tell. In the living room, which had a wall of windows overlooking our backyard, she asked me how I'd managed to build all of this. She asked what I'd done differently. She asked if I'd received help that she didn't know about. I told her the truth. I told her about the years of 80-hour weeks. I told her about taking night classes while working full-time. I told her about starting my business with almost no capital. I told her about the risks I'd taken, the sacrifices I'd made, the determination it had required. And then I asked her a question. Do you understand now why you shouldn't have excluded me from the inheritance? She looked at me with something that might have been shame. She said that she understood that her decision had been wrong. She said that she could see now that I was completely capable of managing money responsibly. She said that she regretted not supporting me. But here's what she didn't say. She didn't say that she'd been wrong to treat me coldly my entire childhood. She didn't say that she regretted not being the mother I deserved. She didn't say that she understood the deep pain her negligence had caused. She just focused on the inheritance, as if the exclusion from money was the only real wrong she'd committed. That was when I understood something fundamental. My mother would never fully understand what she'd done to me. She would never grasp the depth of the emotional damage her coldness had inflicted. She would never feel the kind of remorse that would actually require her to change anything about herself. And that was okay. Because I'd learned that I didn't need her to understand. I'd learned that her understanding or lack thereof didn't affect the validity of my experience. I'd learned that I could move forward without waiting for her to come to the realization that she should have treated me better. By the end of year 6, I was at a crossroads. My mother was facing financial collapse. Eleanor was asking me to help. And I was in a position where I could help. Where I could write a check that would make all of her problems go away. The question was, should I? The question of whether to help my mother consumed me in ways I didn't anticipate. I thought I'd made peace with the exclusion. I thought I'd moved past the hurt. But apparently, forgiveness and the decision to help were two very different things, and I was struggling with both. Marcus asked me what I actually wanted to happen. It was a simple question, but it required me to sit with the uncomfortable reality of my own motivations. Did I want my mother to suffer? Was I hoping she would lose everything, that she would hit bottom and finally understand what it felt like to have nothing? Or was I ready to let go of the need for her to experience the kind of pain she'd inflicted on me? I didn't have an answer. Not immediately. What I did have was clarity about one thing. Helping her wouldn't be about love. It wouldn't be about reconciliation or genuine family connection. It would be about one of three things: obligation, guilt, or punishment. If I helped her out of obligation, simply because she was family, then I would be teaching her that there were no real consequences for her actions. I would be enabling the belief that money could fix anything, including a lifetime of emotional neglect. If I helped her out of guilt, because I felt bad for her situation, then I would be setting a pattern where her poor choices became my responsibility. I would be sacrificing my own well-being to compensate for her mistakes. And if I helped her as a form of punishment, making her indebted to me, making her know that I was the only thing standing between her and ruin, then I would be becoming the kind of person who weaponizes generosity. I would be no better than she was. None of those options felt right. What I needed was a reason to help that didn't involve any of those three things. What I needed was a reason that was about who I wanted to be, not about who she was. That realization came to me during a board meeting for my foundation. We were discussing applications from young people who wanted help starting their own businesses. One of the applications was from a girl who was 19 years old, whose mother had actively discouraged her from pursuing higher education. The girl was working 3 jobs to pay for community college, terrified of failure because she had no safety net and no family support. Reading her application, I saw myself. I saw the version of myself that had been 19 and terrified and convinced that the world was stacked against me. And I thought about how different my life would have been if someone hadn't believed in me. Robert, the mentor at my first real job, had believed in me. My grandmother had believed in me. Marcus believed in me. Without those people, I would have been lost. My mother had never believed in me. But that didn't mean I had to be like her. That didn't mean I had to withhold belief, withhold support, withhold compassion from someone just because they hadn't offered those things to me. I could break the cycle. Not for her but for myself. Not because she deserved it, but because I deserved to be the kind of person who could help without expecting repayment in emotional currency. A week later, I called my mother and asked her to meet me for coffee. We met at a small cafe near her apartment. A place that was, I noticed, within walking distance because she could no longer afford to maintain a car. She was nervous. She kept fidgeting with her napkin, looking like she was expecting bad news. I don't think she expected what I was actually going to say. I told her that I was going to pay off her debts. I was going to help her find a better place to live. Not a mansion but something stable and safe. I was going to set up a financial plan that would help her retire with dignity rather than facing homelessness in her 70s. He started crying. She tried to thank me, to apologize again, to explain why she'd made the choices she'd made. I held up my hand and told her something that I needed her to understand. This help wasn't about forgiveness. I wasn't forgiving her for the inheritance exclusion or the years of emotional coldness. I wasn't reconciling with her or redefining our relationship as something it had never been. This was me choosing to be a generous person. This was me breaking the cycle of cruelty that she'd modeled. This was me deciding that I was going to be the kind of person who helps others not because they deserve it, but because I can and because it aligns with who I want to be. I set specific conditions. I would help her, but she needed to see a therapist to work through her own issues. I would help her, but I wouldn't become her financial advisor or her problem solver. She would need to make responsible decisions going forward. I would help her, but she couldn't expect an ongoing relationship beyond the practical support I was providing. She agreed to all of it. Over the next several months, I worked with a financial advisor to restructure my mother's life. I paid off her remaining debts. I helped her find a nice 1-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood. I set up an investment portfolio that would provide her with modest income for the rest of her life. I essentially created the financial safety net that she tried to prevent me from having through the inheritance exclusion. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd excluded me from money because she didn't trust my ability to manage it. And now I was the one managing her financial security. But here's what surprised me. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like freedom. By helping her, I was closing a chapter. I was no longer defined by what she had or hadn't given me. I was no longer waiting for her to acknowledge the harm she'd caused. I was no longer letting her negligence dictate the terms of my compassion. I was finally free from her. Eleanor reached out to me after learning about the financial help I'd provided. She apologized for the pressure she'd put on me to reconcile. She acknowledged that I'd been right to maintain boundaries. She said she was proud of me, not for the money I'd given our mother, but for the choice I'd made to help while still protecting myself. That conversation with Eleanor did something unexpected. It began to heal the rift between us. Not because I forgave her complicity in the inheritance exclusion. I wasn't sure I would ever fully forgive that. But because she'd shown that she was capable of growth, of understanding, of recognizing when she'd been wrong. We started having coffee occasionally. We started rebuilding something that could eventually become a genuine sibling relationship, not based on obligation but on choice. My mother, for her part, followed through on the agreement to see a therapist. It took her a long time to really process the damage her coldness had inflicted, both on me and on herself. But eventually she came to understand some truths about her own upbringing, her own insecurities, her own inability to offer what I'd needed. It wasn't a magical reconciliation. There was no moment where everything was suddenly healed and we became a functional, loving family. But there was a shift. There was an acknowledgement of harm. There was an attempt, however imperfect, at understanding. And there was something else. There was gratitude. Not entitled gratitude, not the gratitude of someone who felt I owed her my help. But the kind of gratitude that comes from understanding that you've been given something you didn't deserve. That comes from recognizing that someone had every right to let you fall and they chose not to. My mother lived another 15 years after that. She never became wealthy or powerful. She never achieved the kind of success I had. But she had stability. She had dignity. She had the knowledge that her daughter had chosen to help her, not because she was obligated to, but because I was the kind of person who helped. At her funeral, which took place when I was 49 years old, I gave a eulogy that was honest. I talked about her flaws. I talked about the ways her coldness had affected me. I talked about the inheritance exclusion and the pain it had caused. But I also talked about the woman she became in her later years. I talked about her willingness to work on herself, to face her own trauma, to try to understand where she'd gone wrong. I talked about the fact that she'd asked for my forgiveness, even though she knew I might not give it. Most importantly, I talked about what I'd learned from her. Not the lessons I'd learned from her love, since that was limited, but the lessons I'd learned from her coldness. I'd learned resilience. I'd learned that I could build a life without external validation. I'd learned that I could help people even when they hadn't helped me. I'd learned that the greatest revenge isn't making someone suffer. It's becoming someone so genuinely successful, so genuinely kind, so genuinely complete that their opinion of you no longer matters. After the funeral, I established a scholarship in my mother's name through the Second Start Foundation. It felt appropriate. She'd excluded me from an inheritance because she didn't believe in me. So I was going to use my resources to believe in others who were in similar situations. Years later, I would think back to that moment at the will reading. The moment I learned that I'd been excluded, the moment I felt the full weight of my mother's rejection. And I would be grateful for it. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it forced me to become something I might never have become if I'd simply inherited security and possibility. I would have been a different person. Maybe a better person in some ways. But I wouldn't have had the same understanding of resilience, of the value of self-made success, of the power of choosing to be generous when you had every right to be cruel. The inheritance exclusion wasn't a gift at the time, but it transformed into one. It transformed into the foundation for everything I became. And that, I think, is the real definition of karma. It's not about the universe punishing people for their cruelty. It's about the ways that our choices circle back to us. The ways that how we treat people becomes the template for how life treats us. My mother's coldness didn't come back to punish her. But her choices did eventually create a situation where she needed the mercy of someone she hadn't shown mercy to. And I chose to show her mercy anyway. Not because she deserved it, but because I deserved to be the kind of person who could. That was the real victory. Not the money, not the success, not proving her wrong. But becoming someone who could look at the person who hurt her most and choose compassion anyway. That was the inheritance I actually wanted. And unlike my grandmother's money, it could never be taken away.